Okay, so anybody who's ever spent 30 seconds with me knows I'm not a big fan of religion. But in light of the recent events in Manchester, the bombing at the concert, I want to make it clear that I draw a serious distinction between religious people and religious extremists. I have no problem with religious people. I dislike religion, but most of the people who practice it are perfectly good people. They do good things for their communities. They're absolutely fine. I just disagree with them philosophically. That's a far cry from people who commit violence in the name of religion. So I'm going to talk about both things here for a few minutes. I'm going to start off with why I dislike religion in general, and a few of my main reasons. Reason number one is I think it's just silly. Seriously, grown-ups who believe in a magic being in the sky, who either controls our fates or doesn't. If he does a pretty shitty job of it, considering some of the stuff that goes on in the world. But, I mean, it just seems to me like I don't believe in the supernatural, so it seems, from my perspective, rather silly to believe in that stuff. Another main reason is that it doesn't hold up to logic. I mean, let's take let's take a couple simple examples. Noah's Ark. There is not enough water in the world to flood the world. Not completely, even if the ice caps melted. And how did the kangaroos and the koala bears get to the Ark and back again? A few simple questions like that. But let's take an even bigger concept. Let's take the idea that many Christians believe that not only is there a heaven, but there's also a hell. Let's think about that for a minute. Now, some fundamentalist Christians will have you believe the earth is about 6,000 years old. In truth, the universe is closer to 14 billion years old, and we have evidence of that. So let's think about living your life. Let's say you live your life and you make some mistakes and you're a crappy person and you don't seek redemption. So in your 60 or 70 or 80 years on the planet, you do not get to go to heaven. So that means you're going to spend the next several billion years in hell, being endlessly tortured in the most horrible place imaginable with no reprieve. The hell kind of grand plan is that? If I were going to believe in a mythological figure, I think I'd take Santa Claus. At least with Santa Claus, you screw up for a year, you get coal in your stocking, you get a clean slate for next year, you get to try again. I'd much rather have that kind of plan. Another objection I have is that so much of, and I'm talking about a lot about Christianity because that's the predominant religion in my area, but it certainly applies to other ones as well. There's no historical accuracy to it whatsoever. Events and times, and I mean, a lot of scholars, for example, feel there never was a Jesus Christ. Some feel that there was, actually, and that the figure, the myths associated with him, actually the basis in reality is a radical rabbi that lived at the time and came up with some earth-changing ideas that were ahead of his time and possibly even ultimately wound up being crucified. But some of the other stuff, I mean, the idea that Easter, Christianity borrowed a lot of its traditions and kind of co-opted a lot of its things from pre-existing belief systems and religions. Why do we celebrate Easter with bunnies and eggs? Because it was originally a festival celebrating fertility and the sex goddess. And Christians came along and co-opted it for their resurrection myth. Christmas, why do we have a Christmas tree and wreaths? Because evergreens were used as a symbol of growth and life and were displayed during the winter solstice, a time when the days start getting longer again and the sun is returning. It was a celebration of the winter solstice. Even those scholars who believe that there was actually a figure that the Christ myth is based on don't believe that he was born on December 25th. I mean, the most common idea is he was born in the summer. If you want to celebrate somebody who was born on December 25th and actually made a contribution to the world, celebrate Isaac Newton. Another objection that I have is I think many practices of religion are offensive. Offensive to me personally. I find it offensive that as an atheist, if I attend a high school graduation in this area, it's begun with a prayer. I find it offensive that my hometown's graduation week kicks off with a church service. Those things should be completely separate. I find it offensive when somebody comes to my door trying to push their beliefs on me. I find some of the practices, the idea of being told to grovel. I mean, I remember a particular line from one of the Psalms about not being fit to eat the crumbs from the table of the Lord. I find those things offensive. Many of the ideas are outdated. They don't hold up to modern scrutiny. I mean, we know that the Bible, the Quran, all of them are not, written in one day, and they've been developed over hundreds or in some cases thousands of years. The Bible, as we know it today, is only a few hundred years old. It was redone under the guidance of King James. But the stories, some of them are originally allegorical, even though some people translate them literally. They've been translated and retranslated and passed down orally. We don't actually even have any stories about Christ from the time in which he was supposed to have lived. Those stories all got recorded years later, decades, generations later. Excuse me, I have a cold. I'm trying to do this with a stuffed up nose. The historically inaccurate parts are, the idea that there was a flood that flooded the world about 4,000 years ago. We actually have living trees that are older than that would be dead now if that had happened. But some of the outdated ideas, I mean, the Bible contradicts itself significantly. At one point it says, "Thou shalt not kill." In other places it tells you who to kill and specifically how, for such serious crimes as wearing clothes composed of two different fabrics. The Bible endorses slavery. I like to think that's an idea whose time has come and gone. And again, it's not just Christianity. Look at Islam. Look at the Prophet Muhammad. The stories about him say that he married a girl when she was 6 years old, but he was good enough not to consummate the marriage until she was 9. So let's all look up to a pedophile. A lot of these ideas do not hold up to today's scrutiny, but some people still try and live according to these. Now, I would maintain that most people from various cultures have never read their holy text scripture from start to finish. Unlike many people, I actually have read the Bible cover to cover. When I was doing my English degree, I felt it was a useful resource because so much early literature has biblical references in it, so I sat down and read the damn thing. Now, I grew up on Stephen King and Dean Koontz and the Anne Rice Vampire Chronicles and things like that as a teenager. Let me tell you right now, the Bible is the single most horrific thing I have ever read. You want to become an atheist? Read the Bible. You want to have nightmares? Read it. Violence, torture, stonings, horrible, horrible, horrible stuff. And like I say, outdated ideas. Directions on how to properly beat your wife. And again, it's not just Christianity, some of these cultures. All cultures have these things that are outdated. If a woman is a virgin, you may marry her. If not, she should be put to death. Okay, awesome. Now, those are all things that I don't like. And again, historically, I don't like the violence and the misery inflicted in the name of religion. The wars that have been fought, the people that have been killed, the Spanish Inquisition, the jihads. It's really, religion has been the excuse for most of the world's conflicts over the years. I also, I have, looking at history, as a bit of a student of history, we all know that history books tend to be written by the winners. But still, if you look back historically, there are very few conflicts that had an absolute good guy versus bad guy, unlike what you see in the movies. There are a few cases where historically one side has done something so atrocious that we can say, yeah, clearly they were the evil side. The Holocaust, attempted genocide of the Jewish people. And what a lot of people don't realize is they were not the only persecuted groups. They wore the symbol, the yellow star, but other groups were forced to wear a star as well. I was just reading last night about how homosexuals, if they were identified, were forced to wear a pink star identifying them. Communists were labeled. These were horrific acts. I think we can fairly safely say that in World War II, Nazis were bad guys. That does not mean every German person was. It does not even mean every German soldier was, but the leaders were. But the Allies weren't exactly innocent either. How about the rounding up of Japanese citizens in North America, putting them in camps? How about dropping atomic bombs on civilian populations in Japan? As far as I'm concerned, the United States committed the second biggest war crime of World War II on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, you've got all this. This kind of is leading into the idea of extremists. I have no patience for extremists. You want to talk about good guys and bad guys? Looking back 100 years from now, 200 years ago, 500 years from now, however long it takes for these conflicts to find some sort of resolution, there may be some question as to whether the United States was an evil empire, whether the NATO countries were bad, whether the Islamic states were bad. But you fuckers just bombed a concert by a star who's mostly followed by children and teenagers. You blew up a kid's concert. You are officially the bad guy. That's it. There's no excuse for that. There's no redemption from that. Again, that's not all Muslim people any more than all Christians can be represented by the Ku Klux Klan. But that side in this conflict should be shunned. I do not believe in violence as a form of conflict resolution. I believe in education as a form of conflict resolution. I used to tell my kids, if we disagree and I beat you up, I've proven I can beat you up. I haven't proven I'm right. But I'm willing to make an exception in this case. If it were actually somehow possible to separate the people responsible for this type of terrorist action from the thousands and millions of innocent people they surround themselves with, I'd be perfectly fine with NATO bombing them into oblivion. Nuke them. There is no redemption for blowing up a concert full of kids. Now, there have been other horrific acts in history. Richard the Lionheart, during the Crusades, wiped out, massacred 2,000 prisoners of war because he didn't want to leave the men behind to guard them. The North American First Nations peoples did not ask Europeans to come over and bring disease and all the wonderful things that they brought. Now again, the Europeans did not see themselves as the bad guys. And in every instance, they weren't always the bad guys. It's not every person who came. But bad things happened, and there were genocides attempted and caused. I mean, ask a Bayatak. Oh, wait a minute, you can't. There aren't any. So there have been bad things done historically, again, largely in the name of religion. But most times it's hard to decide who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. ISIS, if they really are responsible for the Manchester bombing, have crossed that line. They made the decision easy. Okay, so I'm getting off on a bit of a tangent here because this whole incident makes me angry. We can come back to the idea that if we did not have religion, these things would not have happened. That's true in some cases, it's not necessarily true in others. Sometimes religion is the reason, sometimes it's just the excuse. I'm not saying there would have been no violence in history without religion, but I am saying it's an idea whose time has passed. 5,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, there was thunder, there was a flood. People looked for an explanation. A god must have caused it. Now we know why these things happen. We don't need to look for that anymore. We don't need to place our faith in that. And one last note about the Manchester bombing. I've already seen Facebook blowing up with thoughts and prayers. You know what it means when you're praying for somebody? It means that you are finding a way to make yourself feel better without actually doing anything helpful. I don't want my kids reading religious books unless it's just for the same way that they read books on Greek mythology or history or anything else. They should know about it. If they're going to read something and believe it, please let it be a science book.